You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit MarxistHumanistInitiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. On today's episode, we answer the question, what happens when a group of libertarians take over a town with the intention of setting up a libertarian paradise? Spoiler, bears start attacking people. Our guest is Matthew Hongoltz-Hetling, who will be talking about his recent book, A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear. We will be getting to that interview in just a moment after our current events section. So for the current events section today, we're going to talk about a few different pieces of news related to Russia.
Yeah, so the first thing of significance that we got in the news in the last couple of weeks was on April 15th, and finally we got really proof positive confirmation that the Putin government was colluding with the Trumpites in the 2016 election. You know, this was known, but it hadn't been said by the U.S. government for the obvious reason that you-know-who was president until recently. But the U.S. Treasury finally came out and said that Konstantin Kilimnik was a known Russian intelligence services agent, and that he provided the Russian intelligence services with sensitive information on polling and campaign strategy. And he got that from Paul Manafort, who was the campaign manager for Donald Trump's campaign. So Manafort provided the information, gave it to Kilimnik, and he passed it on to his superiors in Russian intelligence. This is something that, like everybody knew it, but it was never officially confirmed. It was not in the Mueller report. The Mueller report said that Kilimnik had received information from Manafort, but they didn't say, okay, here's what he did with it. And then the Senate Intelligence Committee said, well, there may have been coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia about this, but they couldn't establish it with certainty. So now we get, okay, this happened. So all of this stuff about, no one proved collusion and collusion was fake news and blah, 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 blah. Let's put paid to all of that and let the people who poo-pooed all of this come and say they're sorry for, and we got to make sure this doesn't happen again.
And when you're talking about people who are poo-pooing the Russian investigation, saying that collusion was a hoax, you're not talking just about the Trump orbit, but you're also talking about people on the so-called left who were claiming this was all a bunch of crap and it was all distraction from the failures of the Democratic Party. And were attacking Rachel Maddow and saying this was all just liberal hysteria, right?
Right. Like our good friend Glenn Greenwald, for instance. And doing some research for this segment, just saw the latest interview with him on Sputnik, which is a propaganda arm of the Putin government, basically. And he was still saying, the same thing about the witch hunt. It's all about finding some scapegoats for the fact that Donald Trump won an electoral college victory in 2016, that kind of line. He's still going to say that stuff come hell or high water. He's really in the pocket of people like Tucker Carlson and the people who interviewed him in Sputnik. He's in their pocket, and I think everybody knows that. But then there are tens and hundreds and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people who walked off that pier. I mean, can they walk back? I think it really is high time for them to give up that stuff.
So we're also going to talk about some other recent events related to Russia. Namely, Putin has been engaged in a lot of saber rattling on the Ukraine border, amassing a large amount of troops there. There was also the jailing of Alexei Navalny, who, despite a mass movement in support of his anti-corruption efforts, had to go on hunger strike while in jail to protest his inability to get medical attention. And Putin appears in the past few days to have backed down. He withdrew the troops from the border. He's allowing Navalny to get medical attention.
And, there was a pro-Navalny protest, dozens of protests all throughout Russia. And in contrast to the recent past where the security forces, cops, whoever came down really, really hard on the protesters, this time they didn't. So it looks like Putin is backing down, at least for the moment, which is very, very good news for the people of Russia, to give them some space to struggle, and for us, because it weakens this anti-democratic, all I can do is call it collusion of the far right in this country and the Putin government.
In some of the reporting I've read about the Russian troops building up on the Ukraine border, it was depicted as like political theater that was kind of an empty threat. And so when he pulled the troops away, people were like, yeah, see, he wasn't really planning to do anything. But you really are making it sound like it was a real threat, and then he backed down.
I don't know. I mean, that's the way these things usually work, is they put troops on the border, and it's a show of strength and it's a show of force. It really is not the issue whether they were planning at this moment to attack. Putting the troops on the border is itself an act of aggression. And having to withdraw is a real show of weakness. I mean, that's the way these things always happen. So I know the line that this is all just theater, but it's not just theater. I mean, when think of it, he amasses 100,000, 150,000 troops on the border, engages in saber rattling, and then he says, okay, well, I'm going to withdraw them, but you better not cross our red lines. How does that look? It looks like it's a lot of empty rhetoric and hot air after he was basically compelled by whatever set of circumstances to withdraw. And coming at the same time that he's finally letting Navalny get some medical attention, and coming at the same time that he's easing up on pressure against the anti-corruption movement. This does not look like somebody who's in a very strong position. Way back when Navalny was put on trial a few months ago, he said they're imprisoning one person, himself, to frighten millions. This isn't a demonstration of strength, it's a show of weakness. So I think that's interesting. You could already view the trial of Navalny, the imprisonment of Navalny, first as not strength on Putin's part. I mean, he's going to rather extraordinary lengths to go after one person and make him a symbol and kind of like a martyr, even if he's not dead. That's already really a demonstration of weakness. I think Navalny got that right. And the more important thing is that there are millions. He says they're imprisoning one person to frighten millions. There's millions of people in Russia who are opposed to Putin. And, he can clamp down, maybe he can, suppress them and so forth. The Iranian regime has been doing that for decades, but I don't think he's sitting pretty. And a lot of this has to do with the state of Russia's economy. It's not what it once was. It's very heavily dependent on oil, on natural gas, and because it's not then really a diversified, balanced economy, and it's dependent on extraction, it's very, very subject to the ups and downs of the world market. And what happens to the world market for energy last year with the pandemic, demand goes through the floor, and the Russian economy goes into a sharp decline. The economy contracted by 4% last year. And with all of this, you've got like the country's losing population, and there's a brain drain. And I mean, basically, for most people in Russia, from the statistics I've been able to get hold of, the economy has actually been pretty much in decline for the last 7-8 years, with real income down by about 10%. There's a ton of corruption. The whole system is basically corruption, oligarchs, payoffs, bribes, etc. So it doesn't look like any kind of strong, stable situation. And what Putin is trying to do seems to be through some regional imperialist influence to be able to keep his economy going that way, by siphoning off from neighboring countries that they basically control. I think that's the idea, and if they can get the sanctions lifted, that would help a lot too.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this current event section. Up next, our discussion about Libertarians and Bears. Once upon a time, a group of libertarians got together and hatched the Freetown Project, a plan to take over an American town and completely eliminate its government. In 2004, they set their sights on Grafton, New Hampshire, a barely populated settlement with one paved road. When they descended on Grafton, public funding for pretty much everything shrank. The fire department, the library, the schoolhouse, state and federal laws became meek suggestions, scarcely heard in the town's thick wilderness. The anything-goes atmosphere soon caught the attention of Grafton's neighbors, the Bears. Freedom-loving citizens ignored hunting laws and regulations on food disposal. They built a tent city in an effort to get off the grid. The Bears smelled food and opportunity. And that is the dust jacket description of a book called A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear by Matt Hongoltz-Hetling, who is also our guest on today's Radio Free Humanity.
Matt Hongoltz-Hetling, he's a freelance journalist. He specializes in narrative features and investigative reporting. He's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's won a George Polk Award. The Maine Press Association voted him Journalist of the Year. His work has appeared in Foreign Policy, USA Today, Popular Science, and elsewhere. And he lives in Vermont, not far from beautiful downtown Grafton, New Hampshire. And we're mentioning Grafton, New Hampshire, because that's where his book takes place. Welcome, Matt.
Andrew, thank you very much for having me on the show.
So, Matt, your book is about the saga of a libertarian invasion of Grafton, New Hampshire that began in the early 2000s and went up till recently. Before this, Grafton had seen better days, and then these libertarians descend upon the city of Grafton. Why did they target this town, and what were their goals? What were they trying to accomplish? And how well do you think they succeeded?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting story. So basically, kind of like in the early internet days, the libertarians nationally were keeping in touch largely through message boards. And this idea kind of came out that, hey, we don't really have a libertarian country or a state to call our own. What if we could really form our own community, what we'll call the Free Town, America's first free town, and we will use that as kind of like an example to show the world that libertarian principles, when put into practice, really do work. They thought this would be kind of like this shining jewel to show everybody and hopefully spur imitators and kind of spread the libertarian doctrine in that way. And so they didn't know exactly where they were going to do this. New Hampshire seemed immediately attractive because it's got a favorable tax situation and because, seatbelts aren't mandatory in Grafton and that sort of thing. And so...
No income tax.
Right. Yes. It's a live free or die state, right? And so... right away, New Hampshire was pretty high on their list of places to consider. They sent out a scouting party to kind of like check out a dozen different towns or 24 different towns in the state. And one of the things that was appealing about Grafton is that it actually, as I describe in the book, has this really deep history of anti-tax, anti-governmental sentiment dating way back to like the 1700s when they actually voted to secede from the newly formed United States. They wanted to get away and instead go join Vermont, which at that time was an independent and importantly tax-free republic. So, Grafton just had the right mojo, I suppose.
And maybe, hopefully we're not jumping the gun here, but in short, how well did their project succeed?
Oh, yeah. Well, not well, I would say. I suppose it depends on whose yardstick you want to use. They were very successful in having an enormous impact on the town's culture and on its regulations and budget. They showed up in numbers that were not enormous. They didn't constitute a majority of the town, which started with a population of about 1,000. But they had enough people who were active enough and aggressive enough that they were able to sell a lot of their ideas to the kind of more traditional conservatives that were living in the town. Some of their most outlandish ideas didn't take off really, but they really had a lot of success in changing Grafton into something that was certainly closer to a libertarian utopia than any other town in New Hampshire. And they will tell you that under their influence, Grafton became the freest town in the United States.
Is Grafton a town that still is considered a success by their standards?
One of the kind of interesting thing about libertarians is that even though they coalesce around this idea of individual freedom, it's a very diverse group. They're kind of like notoriously "don't boss me" type people, right? And so to say that there's a consensus on the project's successes or failures is pretty difficult. But that being said, a lot of them would say, we did something important here. But most libertarians, particularly those that are plugged in to the be engaged politically on other levels in the region, most of them kind of hold the Grafton Project at arm's length and say, that was something that's not what we are and what we represent, and so we'd like to not be held accountable for the negative consequences that unfolded in Grafton.
So it was an experiment, and the experiment has ended. There's not still a strong libertarian presence, if I understand correctly, and the people in the town haven't taken the libertarian ways of doing things on board. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct in some respects. Like the after about 12 years, the libertarians all left for reasons that I suspect we'll get into. But like this whole idea of like fiscal conservatism to the point of pain, this whole idea of like cutting budgets, particularly at the local level, is still really, really rampant in the town of Grafton. And, I check in on them every once in a while just to kind of see how the town is doing and to see if they would kind of rebound or if the pendulum would swing the other way and that they would raise taxes excessively. But in fact, what I find is that the town has actually cut its budget even further at their last two annual cycles. And so that spirit of cut off our ears and let's see how bad the bleeding gets, that still seems to be very, very much alive in this town. And I could talk in a little more detail, if you like, about what some of the changes that they wrought on the town were and what the impacts of those were.
Yeah, and in particular with respect to the social services, that would be interesting because that seems to be a big issue, to deregulate, to privatize, to take things away from the state, even if the state is not a state but a locality.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so basically what they did was they challenged every expenditure of tax dollars at the local level. And local municipalities, particularly in a small rural town in New Hampshire, they don't tend to comprise what we think of as the kind of like safety net. The kind of big traditional social service expenditures like, support for schooling for kids with particular problems or financial support for the indigent, that sort of thing. The town doesn't play a huge role in those sorts of functions, but ironically, like everything that the town does, because the town is so disconnected, becomes its own sort of social service. So the very basic protections that we think of in a more urban environment as being something that's kind of more taken for granted, like the condition of the streets and the roads, fire protection, police protection, those sorts of services that are just so very basic. That is what a township controls in rural New Hampshire, and those are the services that came under attack.
And are those all funded with property taxes?
Yeah, it's typically property taxes are the thing that people get all up in arms about. Every town meeting, once a year, they get together and they approve a budget. And that budget is basically diced up, spread out over the property value of the town. And then everybody pays their share based on what that tax-funded budget is. And some of the departments will also receive some sort of other funding from the state. But that's often a function of how well they're leveraging their local dollars. So, if you're a very ambitious town, you might be able to, come up with a police program that's going to tie you into, say, state funding for traffic control, right? And then the state will throw some resources your way to help you tamp down drunk driving on New Year's Eve or something. But mostly what we're talking about are local property taxes.
Right. So how much, when they came in, they invade Grafton, how much did the Freetowners, I guess you call them, how much did they slash social service spending, and what were the consequences of that?
Yes. So basically, they challenge just everything you could think of. So like the public works budget, which goes for road maintenance, that was put in a stranglehold. The police department had just one full-time officer. It's just a little town. They've got their police chief. He's the only full-time guy on the payroll. They cut his budget to the extent that he had to get up at town meeting and say, hey, look, I'm sorry, I haven't been able to get out there on patrol because my cruiser is not road safe and I don't have the money in my budget to do the repairs. The town office, where you have 2 or 3 folks working, doing things like keeping the taxes and the town's books and just kind of keeping the town operating, doing dog licenses for people, that sort of thing. That building became so decrepit that, there were, it was leaky roof, the heat wasn't working, you had ants just kind of like streaming in and out, they it was like working in like one of those old Wild West ghost town buildings,
Wow.
And so there were all sorts of impacts like that. But then also it was like, the library had to reduce its hours so that during the work week, it was only open on Wednesday mornings from 9 to 12.
Wow.
They made the Libertarians put in a proposal that they shouldn't pay the librarian anymore. And they were told that it was a state law that you can't operate a state library wholly on volunteers. And so they said, well, maybe we could just pay them $1 an hour.
Oh my God.
There was like a proposed tax exemption for blind people, visually impaired people. And they said, no, we don't want to give them an exemption because what if a bunch of blind millionaires moved to Grafton to take advantage of that loophole? So it's just like, thing after thing.
What about all the people who are going to gouge out their eyes for the tax benefit?
Right. So basically, the planning board budget was cut by about 95%. There was no zoning in Grafton, so buildings didn't have to conform to basic minimum safety degrees. And one of the big impacts they had was actually more on the physical infrastructure of the town. And that was because a bunch of Freetowners moved to Grafton to take advantage of this project and to be a part of something that they really believed in. And so they were very unattached people. These were folks who could pick up and move to a small random town in New Hampshire with no employment prospects at the drop of a hat, So some of them didn't have money. And so they were living in a bunch of odd encampments in the woods. That they would be yurts and shipping containers and makeshift cabins and tents and mobile homes and what have you. So all of these places just kind of started emerging in the woods, and this is where a large proportion of these guys would live with sort of like I don't know, militia is probably too strong of a word, but just like a very isolated male group of men sort of feel to it.
So Matt, in the book, you stress that libertarians think of themselves as logical and rational. And you seem to take that self description at face value, but it seems to me that the events that you describe in the book call into question how logical and rational these people are. As a popular saying goes, it's often attributed, I think, wrongly to Albert Einstein, but the saying is a great saying. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. So, I mean, we got the Free Town Project, now we got the Free State Project. So, after the events in Grafton, have the libertarians learned from their mistakes, or are they just marketing things different? Are they intent on doing the same thing over but expecting different results?
Yeah, no, that's a really fun and funny way to put it. So, yeah, on the whole logic thing, I do talk in the book a little bit about some research that has looked at correlations between partisan influence and different political affiliations. And that research, I was perhaps as surprised as you were, but it shows pretty definitively that libertarians are more logical than either Democrats or Republicans. And so, you think, boy, well, how can that be? They're saying such bizarre things. And I think, on further reflection, what I've really come to understand is that people as a whole, maybe if you give us all a D minus for logic, they might get a D. Like there's so much research out there, social science and neuroscience research that shows that people are just kind of not logical animals. That far more often we're using the construct of logic to kind of retroactively justify the position that we wanted to take in the first place. And, if you think of, I don't know, the sci-fi trope where you have the robot or artificial intelligence that's been given a directive to create peace on Earth, and then it responds by logicking out an answer that, oh, we'll just exterminate all life on Earth and then it will be very peaceful.
Right.
It's kind of reminiscent of that, in that when you take a logic chain and follow it to its rational conclusion, you can wind up in a place that is logically sound and yet completely indefensible and completely out of lockstep with the rest of the world, to the extent that it becomes its own problem. Jonathan Swift, the Gulliver's Travels guy, he wrote a famous satirical essay called A Modest Proposal, where he kind of very logically tackles the problems of overpopulation and food scarcity in England by suggesting that the poor ought to just simply eat their children. And so logic is an important tool, and I'm sure that you guys as academics have a much deeper understanding and appreciation for the advantages of logic and the ways that we can use logic to parse things that don't come to us naturally. But to rely over much on logic, sometimes logic doesn't doesn't take into account enough, or it doesn't take a broad enough view at a solution, and it can fool us into coming up with the wrong answer sometimes. So, and then on the question of whether they've learned from their mistakes, I don't know that too many people would say that they have learned from their mistakes. The libertarians who participated in the Freetown Project, those who were the kind of diehard believers, they ultimately felt like they were stymied by the political forces and the political realities that they existed in. That you can push for a free society, and even if you succeed at the local level, the state is going to come and put their thumb down on you, and therefore the real problem was not that you were pushing for outlandish ideas and expressions of individual freedom, but that you didn't get to do it enough. And so by and large, I would say the project did not really teach anybody within the libertarian community that this might be a bad idea, although perhaps people outside the libertarian community who saw it were educated, that perhaps, the fact that I support gay marriage, which is a longly held libertarian opinion, and might cause me to describe myself as libertarian leaning, does not translate into I want to live in a place run by libertarians.
Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing, an all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist humanism. Please join us.
We should talk about the Bears, which are in the title of your book. I'm assuming that their place in the title of your book is because they're kind of a good symbol of how things fell apart in Grafton, which we haven't really got into yet in the conversation. Do you want to maybe explain what the situation with the Bears was?
Yeah, absolutely. Bears are fun to talk about. And what I eventually realized as I was working on this book is that the idea of bear management, it's not typically all that politicized. Like we don't go to our city council and talk to them too much about bear interactions, right? It's just not that partisan or political an issue in most parts of the country, excepting the wolves of Yellowstone or the grizzly bears of Yellowstone, that sort of thing. And so bears become kind of a symbol or a battleground in this town. And so the way that it came about was that I've already described how you had a lot of people living in these encampments in the woods and living very freely, living their own independent, free lifestyles. And a component of that free lifestyle was that each one of these individuals in each one of these encampments was storing and managing their food in their own way. And they were each handling their waste disposal, how to throw out their garbage in their own way as well. And so there wasn't kind of centralized enforced systems that would have removed this food and food waste out of the environment in a way that would have evolved over time and been kind of like a proven time-tested opportunity. And so that became a caloric opportunity for the population of bears that was living in the woods in and around Grafton. And so suddenly, from the bears' perspective, all these guys living in the woods suddenly were demonstrating that humans could be a source of food. And because each encampment was doing things in its own way, that meant that they were like a little puzzle. You know, every home became a little puzzle. And if the bear figures out the puzzle, it gets the food. You know, that's literally how you train something to do a task, right? That's how you train your dog to do a task, is you say, hey, if you sit down, I will give you a treat. And in this case, the bears were learning, if you go out and nose through my cabin when I'm not there, I will give you a treat. It's kind of like the same exact thing. So that was one way in which this started to impact the bears. The other way was that as bears started to take note of this and started to invade the town in greater and more persistent numbers, the Freetowners did not do what you or I would do. Most people, if you've got a problematic bear that's coming to your property multiple times, most people in 2020 would pick up the phone and call Fish and Game or wildlife authorities or state officials and say, hey, I got a problem here. But that is so antithetical to the basic nature of the libertarian philosophy that they were much more interested in trying to resolve their bear problems on their own. And so what that meant was that they each came up with their own bear deterrent methods. And this was, one guy put cayenne powder on his garbage so that the bear would get a snootful of cayenne. Some people set booby traps for the bears, to kind of cause them pain. There were, electric fences. Some people played their radios loud, hoping that the sound of talking would drive them away. Some people threw firecrackers at them. And so this, again, by employing a bunch of non-lethal, not necessarily expert-advised responses to the bears, this was also teaching the bears that a lot of human efforts to deter them were not lethal, and if they were endured, they could still solve the puzzle. They could still get the food, right? And so this was also inadvertently training the bears. And thirdly, you had some libertarians and some longtime Grafton residents who just wanted to feed the bears, not unintentionally, but on purpose.
Wow.
These were folks who wanted to assert their rights, and one of those rights was the right to put food out and sit back and watch the bears come in and eat it, just for kind of like the joy of watching them eat. So all of these things kind of conspired.
Wow.
There's an emerging field of study called anthrozoology, and it's basically like anthropology, but the idea is that instead of taking a very human-centric view of things, you look at how different species evolve in a place and how their existence and cultures can impact one another. And so in this case, the change in human culture created a big dramatic change in bear culture, where suddenly you had a lot of bears that were very interested in people. They were so used to being fed that many of them were not even hibernating in the winter. And that's probably the one thing you know about a bear, is that it sleeps all winter. Well, not these bears.
What struck me as really strange, and you explain it in terms of a policy going back to the 1950s, but when people are being attacked by bears, the authorities in New Hampshire, no, that was not a bear attack. There is no such thing as a bear attack, and our motto is Bruin in Bruin, Bruin in New Hampshire, it's your problem, live with it, right? I mean, that to me is like, in other words, New Hampshire's always been kind of proto-libertarian anyway, and that seems rather extreme.
It's outrageous, and yet at the same time, what are they going to say? Oh yeah, we put the bears there, we're sorry. we're sorry you got attacked by our bears. They have kind of evolved in a system in which all they can do is the cheapest thing that deflects blame, right? Or that distorts blame. Clearly, everybody in the state is working hard within the scopes of what they have, and they're all good people and all of that. But when a bear attacks someone, and in my book, the two folks who were attacked are both women living alone in trailer homes in kind of vulnerable populations. And in both cases, the state basically said, oh, yeah, well, that's because you had food, a food attractant for the bear. But in neither case was there actually a food attractant for the bear put out by those women. And so it was really a way to kind of rely on the answer that is most often correct rather than the answer that is actually applicable to this particular situation. And it was a shame because, these women who got attacked were completely blameless, and yet the statements to the press by the state were essentially, that this person had food out and it attracted a bear, and that prevented those women from perhaps getting the support and sympathy that they deserved from their neighbors, some of whom were more culpable for the bear attacks than they were.
What's fascinating, I feel like you could be describing the libertarian reaction to mask mandates. It just feels like the exact same problem where someone's like so obsessed with the abstract idea of their personal freedom. They want to have the right to feed a bear or take their mask off whenever they want. But there's no place for that sort of thinking when you're dealing with a public health problem or a wildlife management issue where your actions have an effect on a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, I definitely see that parallel there. Yeah, it's that idea. We live in a society that has to balance the ideas of individual freedom with the idea of safety and security, for both the individual and the community as a whole. And by staking out one end of the spectrum so extremely that you can't be, it's not even that you can't be bothered, but that you're offended by the idea that you should just put a little piece of cloth on your face in certain situations that most of which you can avoid anyway, in order to tamp down the spread of something that's killed, hundreds of thousands of Americans. It's just kind of ludicrous. And the bear thing was, in a way similar. The connection was perhaps less in their face. At least it was less reported on. But clearly the connection was there.
The title of your book is A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear. I'm waiting for the punchline, but the title might be taken to suggest that what you're telling is a story of libertarians versus bears. But in fact, the libertarians didn't all have the same attitude to the bears. And as you just were recounting, the main victims of the bears were not libertarians, but women, who lived in the area beforehand. But when I was reading the book, not only was I struck by the fact that this is not a libertarian versus bear story, I was struck by the similarities between the libertarians and the bears. They were both invaders of Grafton. They both wanted an unregulated environment. They were both intent on doing just what they felt like doing. Neither of them took the needs or the desires of others into consideration. Neither took kindly to pushback, to put it mildly. So my question, Matt, is when you were writing the book, were these parallels intentional on your part, or is this just a case of the facts speaking for themselves?
Yeah. I mean, so basically, when I first came to Grafton and started reporting on this story, I was not at all aware of the fact that this was the site of the Freetown Project. I was really interested in the bears and why the bears were doing these odd, unusual behaviors, and was kind of looking into it from that perspective. And then slowly I started asking myself the question of why the bears were acting like this, and then slowly putting those pieces together and realizing that there was something very unusual happening in the human culture in Grafton. And so I would say largely it's a case of facts speaking for themselves, but it's also kind of not coincidental. Those parallels that you notice in the book and that I notice in real life are there. It's not a random coincidence. It goes back to that idea that human and animal and plant cultures can impact each other. And so if you start messing with the one, you start messing with the other. And the bears, they're a great animal in that, number one, they're problem solving so that they actually can kind of shift to be an opportunist depending on how the people in their area are acting. But also, bears are they are kind of like libertarians. They are out for themselves. They are kind of trying to figure out what they can do to survive and procreate before they die, and they're not particularly beholden to others. That being said, there is like a measure of social responsibility within bear culture, even. I talk about a bear expert in the book named Ben Killam, and he talks about how bears actually will kind of punish each other for unbecoming behavior, and they can work out kind of adoption schemes where if a mother bear is not able to feed its cub in her territory because of food scarcity, she might convince another bear in a neighboring territory that has more food in it to adopt her cub and let that go on. So even the bears are less libertarian than the libertarians. It's very funny and odd to me to see the interactions between these two groups. It really is unusual. And another thing about bears is that they really occupy an odd place in our mental space. We tend to kind of anthropomorphize bears, but not always in the same way. Like we always think of bunny rabbits in the same way. They're cute, they're cuddly, they're passive, they're fast. But bears, we will project almost anything onto, right? We'll think of bears as cute and cuddly. We'll think of them as very stupid. We'll think of them as very smart. We'll think of them as evil villains from a horror movie. We'll think of them as noble symbols of the wilderness. There's almost no trope that you can't heap onto the back of a bear. And so I think that they prove to be a really interesting counterpoint to the libertarians, because that kind of malleability of what a bear can represent and their propensity for changing their behavior in response to human behavior really made them uniquely sensitive and uniquely able to communicate the message that the libertarians were kind of tampering with the wilderness in a way that was not advisable.
Okay. I'm an economist, as many of our listeners know, and the economics profession has been crawling with libertarians basically forever. So I understand their ideology, but what I don't understand is them. For instance, I know the invisible hand fairy tale by heart. When individuals are running around, acting always and only in their personal self-interest, this doesn't lead to chaos, according to the fairy tale, because market exchange magically creates order out of the apparent chaos. But I don't understand the people who believe this. What kind of person takes this fairy tale seriously? And why do they take it seriously? I've been up, close to them for a very, very long time, decades, but I've never been able to get my head around this. So I'm wondering whether your own up close and personal experience with them, Matt, has given you any insights into this. Who are they? What makes them tick? What are their motives?
That's a good question, and it gives me a chance to say some nice things about libertarians for a change. I met a lot of libertarians. I spent a lot of time talking to libertarians about their ideals and their ideas. And a lot of them were very, very nice to me and friendly to me and welcomed me into their homes and explained their points of view. And so all of that I appreciated, and all of that kind of showed that before we think about the differences between ourselves and libertarians and what kind of sets them apart, we can take a moment to kind of celebrate what we have in common with them. These are people in their community who are often, engaged with the civic world around them, on both a local and a state and national level. They're watching Game of Thrones and Gilmore Girls. They are listening to the same music you're listening to. And like you, they want to make the world a better place, for their kids and for future generations. So like there's a lot of common ground there. But where they really, really differ is at the margins. We think that when we look at the spectrum, a progressive will emphasize safety and security, and a libertarian will emphasize freedom and personal responsibility. And so from their perspective, we're the people who are saying like, well, we're not going to be happy until the world is so safe that everybody lives in a literal box and it's just kind of like piped in food, that will have no opportunity to live a life at all because we've become so focused on keeping people safe. And that is, something that we all ought to guard ourselves against. Personal freedom is important. And I want somebody who cares passionately about individual freedoms to be a part of the ongoing American debate about where we want to land as a society. But the real problem is that they kind of fetishize the free market. As you said, any problem you want to come up with, they will explain to you in a theoretical, not real, but theoretical manner as to how the free market will sort that problem out. And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I have a favorite tool. My favorite tool is my garden hose, and I just use it to water my garden and occasionally fill a bucket or something like that. Their favorite tool is the free market, and it just solves everything to them. If I break my arm, I'm not going to wrap my garden hose around it. I'm going to go to a different tool, one in a hospital wielded by a doctor. But they think that the free market is really going to solve everything. And it's just kind of a huge lack of judgment, I think, or kind of like a willful misunderstanding of reality that supports some of the more personal values that they celebrate. I think a lot of libertarians are drawn to this idea in the same way that I think I see on the progressive side. I see people who they really feel good about themselves by being judgmental about somebody else. If you point out somebody else's ignorant remark and call them a bigot, that you perhaps then feel better about yourself because you're so anti-bigot that you outed somebody else's bigoted remark, and we get a little holier than thou about that. I think on the other side, they are finding the same thing. It's kind of like a race towards extremism where they want to show how individual and free they can be. They have this kind of masculine fantasy about what life was like in the frontier days when an individual would go out and solve all of their own problems and would, if a bear showed up on their doorstep, not call the state, but they would go out and handle it themselves, like a strong individual person. And they believe that over time, if society continues along those lines, that you will wind up with a better, hardier, stronger class of people who will be more self-reliant and be better able to take care of themselves. And it's a different philosophy, and I think it does have a lot of appealing components to it. But the really important thing to remember is that when you try to remove those collective action, government-oriented solutions from a place, that place just inevitably goes to shit. One of the guys that I interviewed in the book who described himself as like an anarcho-communist, he said, if you take corporations and money out of government, you get pure public representation. If you take government out of corporations, you get slavery, And I think that's right. I think they get so focused on the impositions of state authority, which is the only place where they have a vote, that they really are blinded to what to me are much more frightening impositions of global corporations and American corporations that are invading our lives and our freedoms in so much more insidious and villainous ways That it's almost as if because we have some little measure of control over government, we want to beat up government all day instead of really worrying about the people that we don't have any control over.
Yeah, let me just say I don't buy the whole line that these people are more interested in freedom, than the rest of us, and I don't buy the line necessarily. Although it's true in some cases that progressives care more about safety and security than about freedom. I don't accept the counterposition of the two. For instance, when you take the case that you just gave of prostitution, I think that there's a real problem in the way that libertarians conceptualize freedom. I think they've got a distorted, narrow, formalistic, unworkable, etc. conceptualization of freedom. And it's not like they care more about freedom. If somebody is put in a position where to survive, they've got no other means and they have to sell their body, okay, to me, that is not a free situation. And no matter how many times you say that there's a voluntary contract, that's just formalistic. It's not real. And when we take broader groups of people, you look at the entire proletariat, the entire working class of modern societies. These are people who have no means by which to make a living without selling their ability to work. Okay, that's not freedom. I mean, and this was taken away. I mean, their land was taken away from them when the whole system got started. For years I've been trying to get libertarians to address this situation, and they just duck and duck and duck. So I mean, my own, we're Marxist-Humanists. This is a Marxist-Humanist podcast, and Marxist-Humanists, we stand for freedom. So I just want to say I don't want to like give over the ground of freedom to the libertarians. I want to say that what they call freedom, it's really fundamentally a very narrow, formalistic, legalistic conceptualization of freedom. And I think take the mask mandate or mask mandates that you guys were talking about. How is somebody freer by having a whole group of people who refuse to wear masks and refuse to get vaccinated, running around their country and endangering them? How is one made freer by that? So it seems to me we need to have a real discussion about what freedom is.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And really, like, they are talking about freedom, I think, specifically from government. It's almost as if they would sanction literal slavery as long as the government was not the slaver. And it's yeah, it's it's true, and yeah, they're so focused on the government. And perhaps like when you're identifying the government as the only impinger on freedoms that matter, then it starts to absorb a certain amount of, maybe that's what makes it make sense to them. There's an example in the book of how once the bears have kind of run wild and the government has been sent packing, the people in one of those encampments called Tent City, they actually respond to the bear problem by building a little wall around a grouping of cabins. And I thought that was such a kind of a perfect distillation of what you're talking about, was that their efforts to be free from government had been so successful that they were walling themselves into this little crappy space in the woods to protect themselves from bears. Right? Like, I guess that's like the metaphor in the book is like, they didn't want to be free from the bears. They only wanted to be free from the government. And as a result, their lives were made much, much, much less free by the bears.
Yeah, it's a shame they couldn't voluntarily contract with the bears.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And people can get your book on Amazon. It's hardback, it's Kindle, you got an audio version. paperback is about to come out?
Come out this September. It's on its way with an all-new chapter about the Freetowners' secessionist drive.
Well, thanks so much. This has been a great conversation. So thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
I had so much fun. You guys have asked such insightful questions and really got me thinking about some of these issues in ways that I had not before. So I really appreciate both this specific discussion and the important voice that you guys bring to the broader conversation. It's really, really good to know that people are out there thinking about these issues in the ways that you guys think about them. So thank you.
Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.